Hola, ¿qué tal a todos? Bienvenidos a nuestro panorama económico y financiero del mes de marzo de 2025. Mi nombre es Salvador Galindo, cabeza de inversiones de Principal, y tenemos el gusto de tener a Todd Jablonski de regreso. Como se acuerdan, Todd es la cabeza de Asset Allocation a nivel global de Principal. Tiene los portafolios multiactivos a su cargo y el equipo de research también. También nos acompaña Federico Lechuga, nos acompaña David Camposeco y nos acompaña Thor para la parte de equities. Tenemos mucho de qué hablar, entonces, sin más, comenzamos. Muy bien, pues como saben, esto va a ser en inglés para favorecer a Todd, así que Todd, welcome back again. Very glad to have you with us. So maybe we can start with you giving us an update of what you think financial markets are gonna perform this year.
Thank you, Chava. Always great to be back in Mexico. And it's an interesting environment we're in today. Things are a bit different in 2025 than they have been really for the past several years. So let's sort of take an inventory of where we are on key factors. Really, the economic picture is slowing, right? We're seeing a slowing pace of global economic growth, though there are some green shoots in the US manufacturing that I'm actually a little excited about from a growth perspective. I think if there's any upside surprise, it might be US manufacturing. At the same time, financial conditions are pretty tight and restrictive, right? You're not seeing central banks really rescue financial markets with easings that make returns of capital easier across the complex. Equity valuations are high, bond spreads are tight. When you put that together, you've got a scenario in which the markets look fairly expensive and delicate, very delicate, right as President Trump is introducing a lot of tariffs that are disrupting sort of the traditional order of business, introducing noise. I think in the first couple months of the year, you're seeing clients everywhere begin to wonder, how much risk should I take? Is it perhaps time to de-risk my portfolio a bit? We have some interesting research on those subjects, but markets are moving and the economy is beginning to, I think, move to the forefront.
And I would like to add an additional factor, which is liquidity. Now we're starting to see some of those companies that kick off the issuing credit for starting to come back to the market, and that's probably going to increase a lot in the next couple of years. Maybe not all of it in 2025, but definitely 2025 and 2026. Do you expect that reduction or that issuance to reduce liquidity and impact markets?
I think that you will see a reduction in some of the liquidity factors, but the markets still look pretty active to me, right? I see enough buying and selling and repositioning that I do expect, even though credit may not have exact same liquidity profile previously, the need to borrow remains, right? The need to borrow is still there. I think it's just one of the changing fortunes, Chava, right? I also go back to big cap tech. I want to go. That was the dominant play for like the last decade, almost 15 years. Yeah. Since GFC, if you just owned the big cap giants in the US, you did awfully well on equities, Thor. But this is shifting a bit. Europe has been the winner in 2025 to date by a wide margin. You're even seeing Japan begin to outperform. I think investors now have questions about some of the trades that have worked for the past several years. Perhaps there's a shift in the marketplace.
Okay, yeah, excellent. So we'll start with that. So basically what worked in the previous years was US tech, particularly. US outperformance versus the rest of the world in terms of both economic growth, but also market performance itself. And maybe that's starting to come into question, as you mentioned, right? So where do you see the most vulnerability in going forward on those trades?
Well, I think when you look at vulnerability to corrections, you do have to look at valuations, right? And the US stock market, if you look back over the last 20 years, has been cheaper 98% of the time. That means if I throw 100 darts at a calendar, 98 will probably find dates in history where the market was cheaper. So it's tough to commit new capital, right? You do tend to look at where the wobbles can exist, and I think it's in the valuation factors on the mega caps. They've been driven by AI. That boom, I think, has supported the valuations on big cap tech. Let's also not forget how profitable those big cap tech companies were. They still are, I should say, present tense. They're still kicking off a 70%, near 70% ROE from the Magnificent Seven. So while profitability has been there, it's been reliant on AI valuations and an economic assumption of soft landing, right? It has become market consensus that soft landing exists. And with that soft landing, there's been support for the valuations on US equity markets. Over the last week, I might say, you've seen some of those valuations come down, right? You've started to see them come down. Over the balance of the year, however, I'm still focused on fundamentals, right? As long as the earnings delivery is there, the positive cash flow generation is there. In fact, some of the Magnificent Seven are now paying dividends. While we're neutral that group, I'm not ready to underweight US mega cap tech tactically. I think that the potential exists for a market recovery. I'm still a little optimistic on what equities can deliver over the total year. Maybe high single digits are possible. So I remain neutral on big cap tech, though I do worry what will happen first, valuation correction or appreciation of the fundamentals.
And some of the discussion we've been having in our previous webinars relates to DeepSeek and the impact that might have going forward. Do you have a specific view on that?
AI, from what I can tell, requires several $1 billion of investment to get anywhere, right? You even saw calls for $1 trillion investment into AI. While I am deeply impressed, and many of sort of the industry experts are deeply impressed by what DeepSeek and other firms in Asia have brought to AI, the infrastructure development in the US around water, around power, around all the facilities required to process that much data, I think that does give the US a bit of a head start on the AI boom. It will take some time, I think, for catch-up to happen, but good ideas never stay concentrated in one geography, Chava. Good ideas often spread more quickly than I think governments or even businesses can control. So I expect that while a head start exists for the US, the US will certainly not have a monopoly on AI successes.
Okay, excellent. So maybe, David, maybe you can give us an update on how the economic scenario is evolving. And the big question is, now that the scenario is slowing a little bit, do you think central banks are going to shift their tone going forward?
Yeah. So, as Todd already mentioned, there are signs of a slowing economy globally, and that certainly will have spillovers to Mexico. Aggregate demand in Mexico is really dependent on the consumer in the US, and there's been warning signs that the consumer confidence might be weakening, and that weakening of the consumer confidence might translate into lower demand for Mexican manufactured goods and services. So that would certainly impact negatively on the economy. And that's just with the cycle, right? On top of that, you have a lot of uncertainty having to do with tariffs and whether they happen or not. What we do know is that the uncertainty itself is already hampering investment. And that's been one of the key factors for upside surprises in growth when it comes to Mexico. At least that was the case for 2024. And going forward, I would say that component of GDP investment is probably going to be weighing the other way around when it comes to growth. So yeah, in general, the growth picture for the world and for Mexico is quite dim. That presents important opportunities, especially we were speaking about tight spreads. And in general, I would say that Mexican fixed income is properly valued, if not cheap, and especially the higher risk parts of the curve that tend to reflect more growth expectations than monetary policy movements. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that would be a good hedge if you're looking for somewhat muted economic developments in the coming months.
Okay. Excellent. So let me give. Let's talk a little bit about tariffs. Yeah. There's a lot of people that say that tariffs are inflationary, and there's other people that say no, they're not inflationary. They hit growth, and it's a tax to consumers. So basically, the money is going to be spent, but the distribution of that money is going to be distributed differently than it is right now. But the consumer is not going to spend more just because of tariffs. What's your view on that whole discussion?
I would go textbook economics here. Like, if you increase taxes, you just make a larger inefficiency in the market, and that inefficiency translates into higher prices and lower quantities, both at the same time. And the magnitude of prices versus quantities depends on like the relative elasticity of supply and demand, but in general, you would expect both lower output and higher prices, and that would translate into a more stagflationary scenario. And I think that's what most analysts are pointing to in the recent months on the face of tariffs. I think the key question is going to be how long are tariffs going to remain in place? Because in the end, these developments, the economy is slow to catch on, right? Mm-hmm. So if you see like tariffs go in and out quickly, then it might not be reflected on macroeconomic data. But if they stay in place for like longer time, then you could see a reevaluation of the output gap, or like total, like the potential GDP, or like the steady state level of inflation expectations. And once you start to see changes on those variables, that's what leads you to a new macroeconomic equilibrium, right?
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, go ahead, Tor.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you, David, because yesterday night we saw a very important news for Mexico, because we saw Trump applying tariffs, 25% tariffs to Mexico, and this is making everybody not suspect much about tariffs or not, but the key question is what will happen with USMCA trade agreement? What do you think are going to be the implications of these tariffs to the broad picture of the USMCA trade agreement?
Well, I think that Trump has been very good at using tariffs as a negotiation tool. And in that sense, I would expect that this recent hike in tariffs is not going to be permanent, and that it's going to be just a part of a wider negotiation that will eventually conclude at the USMCA broad negotiations. However, I think that those negotiations are going to take time, longer than what I expect tariffs to remain in place, honestly. And I think that if you look at how markets have reacted to the recent news, it seems to be the consensus, right? Because the movements were not large enough, when you look at the size of the tariffs, then you would expect larger movements when it comes to the peso, when it comes to spreads with the US, and you saw like smaller numbers, and that is perhaps reflecting a consensus in the market that these tariffs are going to be short-lived, but maybe this is just wishful thinking. I don't know.
Or perhaps it is another explanation a lot of people give is maybe traders are exhausted with this whole Trump trade thing, and they don't have any conviction that the tariffs are going to remain in place, so therefore they don't want to risk any more capital on that very uncertain trade that could or could not play out, right?
I mean, the Trump bump was in some ways a political manifestation in the markets, right? Yeah. In general, though, I don't look for the government to help create good investments, right? Private enterprise, private investments, that's typically where you go to find the creation of wealth that investors can harness, right, for their portfolios. So in some ways, that bump may have always been ephemeral. It might have always been fleeting in sort of its lifetime. Long term, though, I think what the Trump policies fundamentally do is they try to put America strengthen America's negotiating positions. I'm in agreement with David. I think the most important question is the duration of those particular tariffs. It seems to me that if we're in a short-term kind of situation, it should not affect asset values too terribly through 2025. If it becomes a protracted issue, from the research that I have read, it could cause recession in Mexico. It is a possibility that an extended tariff imposition could cause that, But I do believe it's a negotiating tactic by President Trump to begin to put more on the table as we get closer to 2026 and USMCA renegotiation.
Speaking about recession, are you worried about the GDP now numbers that we're seeing today and lately?
The Atlanta Fed often keeps you pretty closely attuned to sort of what they're seeing things. And in fact, the growth hit expectation is larger maybe than most investors thought.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Not only Mexico.
yeah, as you say, right, it does two things. It is inflationary force and it is a negative for growth.
Yeah.
So if we get the negative for growth, the one thing then I can look at is the Fed puts, right? We have the Fed can act. There's been a lot of calls of late that perhaps the Fed won't be able to ease. I myself said that a few weeks ago, that perhaps the Fed may not need to ease in 2025. But should we get that slowing, I'm a little optimistic that the Fed put, Mexico can do the same. You can get a sense of cuts may come and nothing revalues, I think, things more easily than easing financial conditions.
We've been missing the Trump put, however.
The Trump put is a different animal, right? This is I think for investors, you're going to have to make some very careful decisions around where to take risk.
Yes.
That's it, right?
Yeah.
As you think about your fixed income, your equities, your multi-asset, you're going to have to look and say, where are these policies and uncertainties causing real negative impacts on assets? And where, in fact, does it create opportunity, right? Whether it's through protectionism, whether it's through the tariff realization. I do agree with one thing you sort of brought up. You know, when you tax something, you get less of it.
Yeah.
And if essentially what a tariff is a tax on international trade. So I do think that regardless of what the macro sort of fundamental understanding of the U.S. is, President Trump appears to be attempting to support U.S. manufacturing.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, Federico, what's your view on all of this? The Central Bank of Mexico has had some improvements in terms of the governing board and is much more transparent on what it's looking for going forward. Do you think, and we have seen a big rally in rates here in Mexico throughout 2025, do you expect that to continue?
Yeah, I do. I think that one big part of the question is regarding the governance in the Central Bank of Mexico. Since we have this new governor or new member of the government, and he's a very, very technician guy, I think that the rest of the board are going to put a lot of attention to him. And he actually answered one question last time that he was on a call, on a public call, and he said that even if the 25% tariff from the U.S. were to come, he wouldn't rule out a 50 basis point cut on the next meeting. Their main concern, I think, it is growth. And the growth expectations have come lower a lot from the surveys that the consensus has. And as well for us, we think that right now, in terms of balance between growth and inflation, the inflation part is kind of well anchored around 350. If I put it in another way, the Central Bank of Mexico inflation target is 3% plus minus 1, and they are already there. Even with tariffs, our base case is exactly what you just mentioned. We hope for a duration of tariffs to be in a really short period of time. So in this case, the inflation wouldn't be that hard in terms of this new data. So at the end, I might say that the inflation part of the equation is already kind of well balanced, although the growth part not that well. Since just like David already put it, and I'm rephrasing, since there are a lot of uncertainty in terms of growth, many companies are not investing in Mexico. So again, for the expectations, they're not investing. Foreign investors are moving their investments outside of Mexico. So the concern part of the Central Bank of Mexico, to my view, is growth. So they need to lower its target rate to its lower point that they could. And right now they are at 9.50. The expectation of the market is 9% in the next meeting, that is in a month. And actually what we are discussing right now in the team, if in May we see a cut of 25 or 50, that is a concern that we have. And what we think that might get us to the answer is the equation that it is related to growth. So yeah, we think that the rates are coming down for the short term at least, and we are as well concerned on the growth side of the equation.
Yeah. But this rally has started with the U.S., right? So basically, we have seen rates come down a lot in 2025, and there seems to be a big debate on whether Trump's policies are going to be inflationary, and inflation is not ever going to come back down to 2%. And the market was pricing that was the case at least in December.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing a kind of a reversal of that. What's your thought on that?
You know, from my economic analysis perspective, the Trump policies are indeed inflationary. However, investors, when they look at Chairman Powell's mandate line to get to 2%, break-evens tell us investors don't believe it, right? Investors don't believe that the U.S. is going to get to 2% inflation anytime soon. So I think what that means and what that's telling us is that inflation is likely going to be sticky and stable. And in some cases, if there's one thing that limits the Fed put I discussed earlier, it's that ability to balance it against inflation. Americans are generally pretty tired of inflation. That is one thing I'd also highlight from a political risk standpoint. We printed a 9% inflation number not that long ago, right? Even though you're starting to see the wage price spiral also begin to take effect. So I don't know the U.S. appetite to be able to sustain too much continued inflation. I think that actually informs President Trump's policies a bit, because if there's too much pain in the United States, too much inflation from these policies, it doesn't do well for election potential. In 2 years, you're going to have a newly composed U.S. Congress.
Yes, definitely. And definitely the potential impact of inflation in the U.S. from tariffs, especially if they go to many countries, which we're now not only Mexico, Canada, and China, but now it's the menace of European tariffs now. And if that continues, definitely the inflation might be a stopper for those policies, right?
I think that's certainly possible. You'll have to see how the rest of the world responds, and what is the duration of these things? It's hard to know. I think we're all probably pretty good at forecasting market and economic events, but forecasting political decisions never easy, right? Never easy. So my sense is it's a question of the duration of those views. I don't think it's enough, however, to get the Fed to go back to tightening. Let's go back, because in the worst case, you get too much inflation. The Fed had an incredibly short easing cycle. It's not really even a cycle, a couple of events. And the other alternative would be they'd have to go back to raising rates. That seems improbable to me. That the Fed would be so misguided in its early actions that even the current Trump administration policies would move us back to a tightening cycle. So I think it's at worst case scenario, I'm expecting in 2025 that we just hold the line on the U.S. policy rate in the short term.
Excellent. Okay, so from the story that you gave us last year, let's talk about first the equity technology overweight, right? So, yeah. Well, the preference for technology sector. Do you think that's still a valid story?
I think it's still a very valid secular long-term theme. Tactically, however, it could be a bit out of favor. So for any investor who's got, let's say, a horizon of 5, 10 years, I think you have to be exposed secular to the U.S. technology boom. It was the greatest wealth creation in my investment career, Chava. Over 20 years in the market, if you think, what was the biggest creation of value for investors that you've seen? I'm not actually sure it's the rise of China. I'd actually point to the U.S. tech bubble. For example, US small caps used to be 8% of the US stock market. Today, US small caps are much closer to 4 or 5%. And that's no fault of our small companies. It's just that the big has gotten so big that it's begun to eclipse the small caps. Just to give you a sense of the size and scale, at its peak, the Magnificent Seven had a higher market capitalization than every single company in Europe combined. So these tech giants, I still maintain, Chaba, have competitive advantages. They have resourcing and cash flows that make it very, very difficult to enter a competition. So as I look forward over our 5, 10, even 20-year horizons, I still think I have a strategic bias towards that large cap tech. But right now, when you look at earnings revisions in particular in the short term, it does favor a more balanced view between large, mid, small. And in our portfolios today in the big global framework, we are neutral on those views, on size within the US equity market.
But waiting for a good opportunity to get back in, right?
I would think that if we would get a significant dislocation in the mega cap tech, I would likely be a buyer of those names. It's easier for a stock to recover to a previous high than it is for a stock to suddenly break out and achieve something new, right? I'm willing to bet on reversion to history more than the breakout sort of event.
Wouldn't you be looking for sectors that will benefit from all this technology boom? Any other time in the history when these disruptor companies come up to the world, and after a while they start to spill over their effects to other sectors? Wouldn't you at this moment be looking for those types of opportunities?
You know, I actually think that some of the other sectors and industries are actually that is the demand for all of the technology spending. So it's sort of happening already. So if you want to get better at financial services, you might need to have more cloud computing, you might need more processing power, you might need faster machines. All of that thing says if you want to be better at financial services, you might spend on technology. At the same time, I think if you want to get better at farming, shoe manufacturing, box manufacturing, any sort of traditional sort of business, you're also going to invest in tech to streamline your operations, get better data about your efficiencies and flows in your factories. So in some ways, I think technology spending is a proxy for aggregate spending, right? It is, I think, where all of the companies go from utilities to industrials to transportation. And I think that spending cycle means I still kind of focus my eyes really more at the top in technology. I think they're the clear beneficiaries of the disbursement of that technology into more industries.
So now that, recently maybe the mega cap trade has been running out of steam momentarily, if the secular view that you mentioned is correct, what is your view on Europe? Do you think it's been like a tactical rally, or there's been like a secular change?
I think it's a value rally. I think it's a deep value rally. As I travel the world, David, I tend to also rely on firsthand sort of what I see and what I hear from investors. And I see far more dynamism and wealth creation in emerging markets than I do in Europe.
Right.
It's the lack of technology is one component of it. Regulation is a component of it. I think cultural values are a component of it. What is the pace of adoption of new technologies? Yeah. What I see in Europe is a remarkable run over the last 2 months. But let's not forget, again, US stock market was up 50% over the last 2 years. It's essentially flat year to date as of this recording date. So in some cases, a little bit of catch up from the rest of the world. China has had a nice rally. Europe's had a nice rally. To me, that feels like more of a tactical event than any kind of secular shift.
Okay, so another question I have for you, Todd. So basically, the U.S. Outperformance and U.S. exceptionalism going forward, do you think that's still a valid argument, thesis?
It's been interesting to watch over the last several years, and we're at a bit of, it feels like an inflection point, so it's a good time to sort of talk about what's happened and what's the outlook. I think fundamentally what you've seen is the US more than anybody else is able to use policy to help sustain itself during difficult times. The American response to COVID was what? It was money for everyone, right? Handing out money, mailing out checks, and a few trillion US dollars worth of fiscal stimulus at the same time. That might have actually been too much. It might have been too much interventionism. But it did support the US economy at an time when, post-COVID, it was difficult for the rest of the world. It also added liquidity, made capital easier to borrow, and fueled, as I've said, the most significant historical wealth creation of my investment career. That is the rise of the tech bubble and the Magnificent Seven. So it wasn't just US policy, but it was also market returns, right? If you look at the value of the US equity markets to the rest of the world, we're at a peak historically for how big the US can be. The ACWI is now moving closer to 60% plus on a US weight. As I mentioned, you saw the Magnificent Seven achieve a market capitalization greater than all the Chinese listed companies combined, or if you prefer a different measure, greater than the value of all the European companies combined, in just 7 names inside the US. So that's what's really, I think, given investors the illusion of American exceptionalism, right? I think it was policy that helped support wealth creation and investments in technology, cloud computing, AI, that led to the creation of a massive technology sector. So what I would highlight is no, I don't think that Americans in particular have any monopoly on good ideas. I'm not even sure that the structure of government and capital markets and other regulations are any more conducive. But I do think there's advantages to size and scale of the economy, which gives us, I think, a greater cushion and the greater on downside events and a greater investment when we're seeking upside that kind of gives the US some structural advantages. It won't always be year to year, even 3-year window by 3-year window, you're going to see outperformance in ex-US equities from time to time. But I do think that the technology sector in particular can't be replicated. I've actually tried to build a portfolio that resembles the US out of ex-US pieces, and you can effectively replicate every component of the US market except for the technology sector. So as long as the technology remains the dominant story, I think that that's something that continues to promote American exceptionalism. One final point, I'd also highlight that when you think about sectors, a lot of people just look at the US technology weight and say, okay, that's the size of the technology sector. But don't forget, some of the Magnificent Seven was moved into telecommunication services. Some of the Magnificent Seven was moved into consumer discretionary. In fact, if you put the true technology weight, it would be an enormous, enormous sort of component of the market. So it's something that has begun to show up in all the different sectors and industries across the US space.
Excellent, excellent. So let us move on now to our outlook for markets. So we definitely have your insight that US equities will probably continue to outperform on the long term, and maybe this type of repositioning could be buying opportunities? Perhaps.
I think we need to come a little further down. I mean, right now, tactically, I have a preference for equities. It's small. I have a small tactical preference for equities, and I offset that with a very slight underweight to fixed income and alternatives. Notably, we haven't got into currency too much in this conversation yet, but I think the Trump policies also and tariffs favor a stronger dollar. So for investors outside the US, that's an opportunity to participate. Owning US dollar equities, owning US dollar fixed income, you can see an appreciation in relative currency, and then when you bring it back to pesos, that's an area I think that investors, at least in Mexico, can benefit from.
Excellent. Right. So, Federico, now's your case. You already told us you expect more rally in the fixed income, but do you expect we're starting to see some volatility out of the tariff announcement? How bad could that get?
David already mentioned about it, that the markets are a little hesitate about how long the duration will be on this new policy. And I as well think that the duration will be low. The market is also in that position. If that wouldn't happen, let's say that this 25% to Mexico stays for the year long, I mean, we would have sell-off bias all over the curve, sell-off on the currency, in the Mexican peso. I would expect that the curve would steepen, that coming from the long end of the curve rather than the short term, because I still think that there, even though the 25 stays the year, the whole year, there, I think that there is space for Banxico to cut rates. Wouldn't be that much, but it still is some space. So yeah, I think that we would have a steepening bias, and I would be guessing that perhaps easily can go higher than 30 basis points easily, and that would happen on just in a few hours. And I would put it in another way. This is not my base case. My base case is that the government will do whatever it takes not to happen, not to be positioned in this scenario. So on Sunday, sometime this week, we have some news that our local government will discuss with the U.S. government about what just happened. So the duration of this, I'm expecting to be really, really short. And if that happens, probably what we just saw today, this steepening bias, and we saw a 15 basis point steepening, perhaps it corrects itself. The main movement, it came from the U.S. curve. The U.S. curve, let's only speak about the 10-year. The 10-year came from almost 470, a month and a half ago, up to 411 just a few hours ago. That rally made that the local rates came around 100 basis point rally, which is quite a lot. If you compare from before the new government, the local new government came in to the office, to now, we're almost at the same levels. So that makes interesting what the market is doing. So for the short part of the curve, we are very, very positive. This is our base case. For the medium and the long part of the curve, we are a little more hesitant. We are more on a neutral basis in terms of duration and exposure, because I don't think that it is reasonable to bet on politics, because it might go to either way. So that is the reason why we are neutral. Although, for the long-term investors, we are very positive on the long part of the curve. And the reason is that if you look at the past 15 years, we're almost at the highest point. Not at the highest, but we are kind of there. So that is the reason why for the long-term investors, it is buy the inflation-linked bonds and as well the nominal ones. So it depends on the horizon where perhaps you should be, but either way, right now I am more neutral in terms of the risk.
Okay, excellent. So Thor, now equities. We have seen a big rally in Mexican equities. Some of that has raised recently because of this tariff talk. What's your expectation for local equity?
Okay, so my take here, it's part of what everybody in the table has mentioned already. Mexican equities are part of emerging markets, and we need emerging markets to rally for Mexican equities to go up. And if thought is right on U.S. exceptionalism, we might not see that rally on emerging markets. We might not see that rally on Mexican equities, and that's risk on that's a asset class preference. But on Mexican equities particularly, we saw since the election of President Sheinbaum and after Donald Trump's election, a fall of almost 15% in the Mexican equities. We saw a derating in the PE multiple. We are at historical lows. We are looking at deceleration in the economy. We are at all-time highs in rates. And yesterday we saw a negative news again on tariffs. So we have a lot of negative and momentum on Mexican equities. So what we need is, first of all, clarity on a political economy. First of all, we need to see those rates falling, some clarity on tariffs, and also a less optimistic U.S. exceptionalism story. So we need a lot of things in Mexico for Mexican equities to rally. But at the same time, since last year, we have a lot of discount in prices. We are at historical lows in multiples, and that's why we saw this rally at the beginning of the year, because it was a value rally all across the globe, in Europe, in emerging markets, in Mexico as well. So it's difficult if we don't have clarity looking forward. But again, for the long-term investors, we are very optimistic of the long-term opportunity for Mexican equities. In the short term, we are tactically a little bit neutral, because we don't have any, we don't like to do bets on political events. So I would leave it there, Chava.
I would add also, if you compare U.S. equity earnings growth rate with the Mexican equities growth rate, they're not that different, right? They're
pretty similar.
And the valuation, one is 25 times PE and the other one is 12 times PE. So there's definitely that potential rally coming whenever markets stabilize. However, definitely for a more structural overweight, we need much more clarity, I think so. But yeah, the risk is whenever things calm down, we get this type of bouts of outperformance, right? From emerging markets and Mexico in particular, right?
Right.
Excellent.
I'd just add to it, I led with the United States had been cheaper 98% of the time over the last 20 years. By the calculations that I show right now, Mexico has been cheaper just 6% of the time. That's a huge gulf, right? A huge gulf. And to be clear, the earnings delivery is somewhat similar. I also note that as you look into the US cap spectrum, large, mid, small, growth value, what's been the best performing group year to date? It's large value. So the US is rhyming with the rest of the world. There has been this value rally, and it's been a long cycle of growth outperformance. Tor laid out the scenario that he thought that could come to pass for Mexican equity strength. It has come in the first 2 months. It could have a bit more leg to it. It all will depend, I think, on political forces, policy rates, and the rest of the unfurling of 2025.
And I would also compliment, I think some of the factors that help the U.S. maintain higher growth rates also help Mexico, because we get access to cheap energy. We get access to technology, supply chains. So I think some of that structural outperformance from the U.S. helps the Mexican economy and the equity sector here in Mexico. At least not as a big beta play, but definitely we get some of that earnings growth kind of spilled over.
It almost makes an investor think that a tariff-free North American trade zone would be a good idea. And that's something that I think that even President Trump is aware of, and even through these negotiations, I do expect that North America remains an economic bloc wherein we will see in the future few barriers to trade.
Excellent. It's all right. Thank you very much. This was very helpful. Thank you very much, Todd, for being with us again. We hope to welcome you in the future again. And thank you, Federico. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tor. And with that, gracias a todos. Les recordamos que pueden hacer preguntas en el chat y con gusto se las contestamos en vivo. Y gracias a todos. Nos vemos el mes que viene.
Aquí tenemos algunas preguntas. Primero, que si consideramos que viene la recesión más fuerte en México en los últimos años y qué podemos hacer para proteger nuestras inversiones. Bueno, en términos de si bien o no una recesión y la magnitud de esta, bueno, ciertamente la probabilidad de una recesión en México pues ha incrementado en el margen. En realidad, si esto se llega a materializar o no, va a ser, como ya comentamos, dependiente de la duración de estas tarifas, ¿no? Si las tarifas que se han impuesto últimamente llegaran a estar pues más de un trimestre o más, incluso durante todo el año, sí podrían tener un efecto pues ya claramente negativo sobre el PIB. Ahora, sí también se espera, la mayoría de los analistas económicos, y acá también esperamos, que este efecto sería más evidente hasta el 2026 y 2027, ¿no? Ahora, qué podemos hacer para proteger nuestras inversiones? Pues hay varias clases de activos que claramente han demostrado ser de ayuda. La primera de ellas es el dólar, ¿no? En particular, el peso tiende a depreciarse ante estos escenarios de volatilidad asociada a tarifas. Entonces, inversiones en dólares, como ya había comentado todos en la plática que acabamos de tener, pues podría tener ciertos efectos ahí para ayudarnos a blindar cierta volatilidad. También una caída importante en el crecimiento pues debería de tener un impacto positivo en las tasas, ¿no? Al disminuir las tasas, también, si bien esta es una apuesta un poco más de mediano plazo, también debería de ayudar, ¿no? La siguiente pregunta es, ¿qué opinamos sobre cancelar la compra de productos de importación de Estados Unidos? En realidad, el mejor escenario es uno en donde regresamos a realmente explotar nuestras ventajas competitivas en el ambiente internacional, tanto México como Estados Unidos como el resto del mundo, ¿no? O sea, lo mejor sería un mundo en donde hay mayor libertad de comercio y eso ciertamente ayudaría a incrementar el producto potencial del mundo y a bajar los precios, puesto que pues, los países más competitivos en manufacturar ciertos productos serían los que efectivamente los están manufacturando, ¿no? Entonces, pues mi opinión es que cancelar la compra de productos de importación de Estados Unidos pues sería malo para los americanos, pero también malo para los mexicanos, ¿no? Esa es la parte que es importante entender, que el comercio es mutuamente beneficioso y entonces en términos agregados. Y entonces, pues cualquier tarifa es pernicioso para el crecimiento de la economía global de ambos lados, ¿no? O sea, del que compra y del que vende. Esa es la parte que es importante, ¿no? La siguiente pregunta es, ¿qué podrían anticipar sobre la respuesta del gobierno de México sobre los aranceles de impuestos? Esta es una muy buena pregunta, ¿no? ¿Qué se puede anticipar? Yo la verdad esperaría que sea una respuesta medida y que esté bien enfocada hacia los sectores de la población que tienden a apoyar más a Donald Trump, ¿no? Eso lo vimos durante la primera administración de Trump, en donde pues, también pusieron tarifas a México, y la respuesta de México fue justamente tratar de causar el mayor daño político y el menor daño económico posible, ¿no? Yo esperaría que esa sería la respuesta, pero también espero que esta respuesta sea gradual y que realmente la presente administración mexicana abra la puerta para liberar estas tensiones sin caer en una guerra de tarifas y más bien mantener el diálogo y enseñar cooperación. Me da la impresión de que lo que ha dicho la presidenta recientemente apunta hacia esta estrategia que la verdad me parece muy, muy pertinente y muy sabia, porque la alternativa, que es el approach, el enfoque que ha seguido el gobierno canadiense con Trudeau, sí me parece que nos llevaría a una situación de enfrentamiento y encono que no es beneficiosa ni para Estados Unidos ni para México, ¿no? Entonces, eso es lo que espero que suceda, eso es un poco las señales que ha dado la presente administración. eh,
Y si me permites, David,
claro.
brevemente mencionar las noticias hace, yo creo que 10, 15 minutos, acaba de aparecer ya en los titulares
que las tarifas que puso Trump a México las está quitando a partir de este momento, las van a patear hasta el 2 de abril, o sea, digamos que lo que vivimos en tanto en febrero como la incertidumbre de los días de marzo otra vez está en la mesa, o sea, ya no están los 25% y probablemente, bueno, al menos eso es ya algo más mi expectativa personal, vamos a estar viviendo en periodos donde cada vez que haya posibilidad de negociar, lo va a seguir haciendo Trump y lo que van a querer hacer es, y que ya lo hemos mencionado varias veces, sentarse en la mesa para discutir el tratado completo en lugar de estar pateando cada 30 días las tarifas. Entonces, bueno, solo cerrar ese punto con que ya quitó las tarifas lo que queda de este mes.
Sí, excelente, o sea, de acuerdísimo contigo, ¿no? O sea, en realidad sí es importante mencionar que la volatilidad asociada a tarifas va a ser un fenómeno persistente de aquí a que se vuelva a renegociar el TEMEC, y esa fecha es incierta. A ver, hay cierta certidumbre que va a ser a mediados de 2026, aunque hay especulación de que se puede adelantar, ¿no? Pero coincido contigo, Fede, la parte importante acá es es que la volatilidad va a seguir, ¿no? La última pregunta que tenemos, bueno, creo que es la última, no, tenemos dos. Otra pregunta que es un poco más al grano, nada más dice que si debemos invertir en dólares, ¿no? Ahora yo un poco lo que digo es, en realidad lo que necesitamos, y es algo que ya habíamos dicho en otras ediciones de este panorama, es que lo mejor que puedes hacer es tener un portafolio bien diversificado, balanceado y que realmente toma posiciones en diferentes clases de activos. Y eso eh, debería de ayudarte debería ayudar a blindarte de estos eventos de volatilidad. Entonces, más allá de si debes o no invertir en dólares, me preocupa un poco, y la pregunta suena un poco como todos los huevos en una canasta, para ponerlo así de simple. Y no, ¿no? Yo diría, el enfoque prudente es tener un portafolio diversificado, claramente con cierta exposición a dólares, claramente con exposición a yenes, con exposición a euros, con exposición a renta variable, con exposición a renta fija, un portafolio bien balanceado como los productos que tenemos acá, como lifestyles. Eso sí, sería mi recomendación para inversionistas de mediano a largo plazo, ¿no? Eh, Ahora, la siguiente pregunta, ¿no? Es, ¿cómo afecta a la economía lo que sucedió entre Estados Unidos y Ucrania, ¿no? Eh, Bien, en realidad, eh, el evento de Estados Unidos y Ucrania tiene muchísimas ramificaciones, ¿no? Eh, Primero, probablemente ayuda a tener mayor certidumbre en el suministro de materias primas en Europa, en particular energético, que ha estado afectando de manera muy negativa el desempeño de los países de la Unión Europea, y en particular de Alemania, que tiene mayor dependencia energética de estos combustibles fósiles, de gas natural, etcétera. Y entonces, pues un poco, a ver, la posibilidad de que el conflicto se enfríe, no sé si se resuelva, todavía es demasiado pronto para decirlo, pero que el conflicto se enfríe y que haya un poquito de mayor certidumbre debería de ayudar un poco al desempeño económico en Europa, ¿no? Ahora, también uno de los resultados de esta negociación es un empuje mucho más claro de que Europa debe de incurrir en mayor gasto militar. eh, y que es al final lo que Donald Trump quería, ¿no? Quería un poco forzar a la Unión Europea a también pues contribuir de manera militar a su seguridad, y no tanto utilizar la fuerza militar de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Ahora, eso en realidad, ¿no? El gasto militar es un gasto improductivo, ¿no? Es un gasto que no sirve, y cuando lo gastas, de hecho, destruye valor en vez de crear valor. Entonces, el gasto militar en general, pues no es muy bueno para el crecimiento económico, ¿no? Ahora, contablemente, pues sí se ve en el PIB. Si el gobierno gasta en más tanques y más aviones, pues el PIB sí se ve más grande, ¿no? Pero los aviones y los tanques no son muy productivos porque no los usas, o cuando los usas para destruir cosas. Entonces, no es una muy buena inversión. Ahora, en ese sentido, sí, yo esperaría pues mayores presiones fiscales en Europa como resultado de esta mayor necesidad de gasto, mayor emisión de deuda de Europa como resultado de esta mayor necesidad de gasto, y de nuevo es un gasto que tiene un multiplicador fiscal muy bajo, es decir, que tiene, o sea, no es como que estés construyendo carreteras que ayuda a que la gente se mueva, ¿no? Es un gasto medio inútil, y en ese sentido, pues yo tendría un poco de cautela sobre los efectos benéficos de largo plazo de esta parte, ¿no? La parte de cierta certeza y estabilidad en términos de la distribución de materias primas y de gas, sí seguramente debería de ayudar, ¿no? No sé si alguien quiera, Fede y Carlos, si tienen ahí algo que agregar, pues ahí me interrumpen, ¿no? Como estamos todos aquí.
Yo creo que con respecto a la pregunta, me parece que has mencionado muy bien los efectos. Al final y me parece perfecto cómo comenzaste. Tiene muchísimas ramificaciones, y eso es la razón de por qué hemos visto tanto cambio en los mercados y en el movimiento de las economías en los últimos 3 años. Entonces yo me quedaría con eso. Y me saltaría la siguiente pregunta, que ya es relacionada a mercados.
Sí.
La pregunta es, ¿qué efecto, o sea, con esto que acabamos de mencionar hace un momento, que Trump nuevamente pospone las tarifas un mes más, el efecto a los mercados, ¿cuál sería? Pues la respuesta, yo lo diría al revés. Yo creo que el efecto, o sea, la respuesta a esa pregunta es, yo creo que el efecto va a ser prácticamente nulo. Y más bien lo que yo diría es, hay que recordar que desde que ganó Trump las elecciones, y cuando ya fue público que el Senado, bueno, que la Cámara Alta y la Cámara Baja se la llevaron, el mercado entró en un modo de posible mayor volatilidad, mayor riesgo hacia México. Y entonces, cuando tomó el poder este Trump, y no puso las tarifas inmediatamente, a partir de ahí comenzó un rally en los bonos mexicanos, la renta variable de Estados Unidos estuvo con rendimiento positivo, no tan positivo como Europa, pero con un rendimiento positivo. Y eso se fue permeando durante las siguientes semanas, y llegó hasta el día de hoy. Cuando puso las tarifas de 25% esta semana, a principios de esta semana, el mercado, y aquí voy a hablar puntualmente del tipo de cambio, no subió mucho. O sea, el peso mexicano, antes de que fuera oficial que las ponía, estaba alrededor de 20.40. Cuando ya fue oficial que las tarifas estaban, el peso subió, al punto más alto fue casi 21, 20.99. Y a partir de ahí solo estuvo cayendo o apreciándose el peso contra el dólar.
Sí, yo creo que todo lo que estás describiendo refleja un poco que el mercado siempre ha estado más o menos del lado de que probablemente estas tarifas completas, 25% de manera permanente, no van a suceder, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, pues sí, la respuesta ahí, pues suave, como estás describiendo tú, pues nos está diciendo que es poco creíble que estas tarifas realmente persistan, ¿no? Ahora, ya al punto de la pregunta de si va a haber incertidumbre de tiempo completo o no, yo creo que la respuesta es sí, ¿no? Es hasta que no se renegocie el TEMEC, pues y lo mencionaste ya varias veces, ¿no, Fede? O sea, en cualquier momento que se abra cualquier negociación, las tarifas van a salir y van a estar dando vueltas en la conversación durante un periodo prolongado, y eso va a generar volatilidad, ¿no? Aunque ciertamente, pues es un poco como Pedro y el lobo, que también es la otra cosa que quieres decir, ¿no? Que cada vez el impacto en la volatilidad de estas amenazas pues va a ser menor, porque pues, se van a volver cada vez menos creíbles, ¿no?
Totalmente de acuerdo. Creo que aquí te voy a aventar la última pregunta que tenemos hasta el momento. Es de tema económico, en donde saludamos a esta persona de Chile, en donde nos pregunta qué impacto vemos hacia Y aquí me gustaría, yo voy a complementar su pregunta. Él habla de Sudamérica, yo la complementaría con si nos pudieras dar tu punto de vista económico de esta incertidumbre con respecto a Latinoamérica, o sea, con respecto a países emergentes, ¿qué es
Sí.
lo que ves desde el punto de vista económico?
Pues sí, a ver, en particular en el cono sur y varios mercados emergentes se caracterizan por tener un ciclo muy definido por los commodities, ¿no? México es una excepción realmente, pero muchos países realmente siguen el ciclo de demanda global por commodities, ¿no? Por acero, por hierro, por cobre, como es el caso de Chile, productos agriculturales, petróleo, como es el caso de Brasil. Entonces, en realidad, muchos países emergentes pues dependen un poquito del ciclo de commodities, ¿no? Ahora, en ese sentido, ¿cuál es pues el big picture aquí? El big picture es, las tarifas con México y Canadá van y vienen, pero la historia con China, por ejemplo, no ha sido va y viene, ¿no? Esas realmente sí están ahí. Yo a reserva de que ustedes opinen algo diferente, pero yo creo que esas sí tienen mayor probabilidad de permanecer por un tiempo prolongado. Y como les digo, eso en general tiende a disminuir el producto potencial global y entonces pues ahí tienes una contracción de demanda de todos estos commodities y eso pues es tácticamente, ¿no? Pernicioso para estos productores de commodities como cobre, acero, níquel, etcétera, ¿no? Y eso es malo en general para los mercados emergentes, además de que ha tendido a apreciar al dólar, que también es malo para mercados emergentes, que puedes argumentar que es otra cara de la misma moneda. Entonces, está esa parte, ¿no? Ahora, por otro lado, tienes las tendencias no tan relacionadas a tarifas que también ya mencionábamos en la conversación de que hay señales cada vez más claras de debilitamiento en la economía de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y eso, pues, representa una proporción bien importante de la demanda global y entonces, pues un consumidor más débil que genera menos demanda, pues también eventualmente tiene un spillover negativo a menor demanda por commodities y pues eso también debería de ser pernicioso ahí para el desempeño económico de las economías emergentes. Ahora, ¿cuál es el elefante en el cuarto? ¿Cuál es el escenario que podría darle la vuelta a lo que acabo de decir? Pues ciertamente China, ¿no? China se ha caracterizado por tener un desempeño económico pues bastante mediocre en los últimos 2 años, pero sí hay señales por parte del PBOC, del Banco Central de China, me refiero, y del Politburo, del Sistema de Planeación Central de China, que realmente sí quieren estimular la economía y regresar a una senda de crecimiento pues, más consistente con lo que se veía viendo de 2015 a 2018, por decirlo así, ¿no? Ahora, si llegan a dar los estímulos fiscales y monetarios necesarios para que la economía de China realmente se reacelere, eso sí sería muy bueno, sobre todo para Brasil y Chile, que tienen un ciclo económico un poquito más pues compaginado con el de China, de nuevo por esta relación de commodities, ¿no? No tanto así el caso de México. No sé, Fede, ¿tú cómo lo ves de tu lado? O sea, porque también hay un componente de que hay mayor riesgo, mayor volatilidad, eso es malo para los flujos de deuda hacia pues, activos un poquito más riesgosos como es la deuda latinoamericana. No sé, ¿qué opinas ahí?
Claro, de hecho, entrando a temas de mercado, la conexión que tenemos, pues estamos muy cointegrados, en el sentido de que si los bonos brasileños empiezan a tener una venta masiva o los bonos mexicanos tienen una venta masiva, lo mismo se va a ver reflejado con los bonos de aquel país, igual que con Chile, en una menor proporción. Sin embargo, o sea, sí, en tendencia nos movemos de manera similar. El riesgo país también es otra variable que se mueve en la misma tendencia. Digo, sabemos que Brasil tiene temas idiosincráticos grandes que están resolviendo en aquel país. Pero en términos generales, sí, el mercado de bonos se mueve en tendencia en todo LATAM. Y con esto voy a aprovechar la oportunidad que nos abrieron para recordarles que hemos estado mucho más activos en redes sociales. Y entonces pueden entrar a LinkedIn, a YouTube, seguirnos y tenemos una integración una integración regional con Latinoamérica. Entonces pueden encontrar reportes que hablamos de cosas de Chile, cosas de Brasil, y simplemente siguiéndonos en redes van a encontrar toda esta información. Ya no vemos más preguntas en este momento. Pues David, si quieres, por favor, cierra, te paso los honores.
Muchas gracias, Federico. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos por su participación, por sus preguntas. Nos vemos en el siguiente panorama económico y financiero. Que tengan muy buena semana.